Hi everybody, thanks ever so much for coming down to this first session of History Day, and welcome to this panel on digital history. I'd just like to introduce the panellists here. So today we've got speaking to you my colleague, Jonathan Blaney, who's digital, he's got a very long title these days, it used to be shorter. Digital Projects Manager and Editor at British History Online and works at the IHR. Professor Jane Winters, who's the Professor of Digital Humanities at the School of Advanced Study, and Judith Siefring, who's the Head of Digital Research at Bodleian Libraries at the University of Oxford. So Jane's going to start, and she's going to begin by giving us a little overview of the field of digital history as she sees it at the moment. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks very much, Danny. I hope everyone can hear me because the microphone is over the wrong height whether you sit down or stand up, but do shout if you can't. As Danny said, this is kind of a personal view of what digital history, what I think digital history can be, is sometimes. It's not anything fixed, it's just some thoughts, as the title says. And like any good historian, I wanted to start off by historicising it a little bit, because we tend to think of digital as something that is very, very recent, the last kind of 10 to 20 years, but in various forms, computational or electronic history, however people described it, has been around for a very long time, or well, a relatively long time anyway. I don't know how many of you have heard of plyometrics, which was the first attempt to do real quantitative analysis in history. It tended to have a very economic focus, and that started out in the US in the late 1950s, and then was really discredited in the late 1970s because of its oversimplification and this idea that quantitative methods could solve historical problems in some way. And that's the reason I think so many of us don't do any kind of quantitative skills training as of now, because we're still suffering from this. And then from the mid-1980s onwards, it became history and computing. And a lot of the themes and concerns of the scholars who were involved in the history and computing movement still really influence what we do today, I think. And now we've got digital history. We've moved away from e-journals to digital journals. We're not electronic anymore, we're digital. But I also think in some ways we're moving back towards just history again, and that we're doing history as we've always done it and thought about it, but just using new digital approaches and tools to help us do that more effectively. So my argument really is that we're all digital historians in some way. It's pretty much impossible to do research without reading a source online, without using a word processor, which changes the way you write, the way you order things. We're all digital, and there's a kind of spectrum, and I think everybody's on it to some extent. Digital history, I think, is very hard to define, and in my view that's probably a good thing. If you think you're doing digital history, then you're doing digital history, and don't let anyone try to tell you that you're not. But I think for me there are four kind of main themes that I've come across in my own work. Communicating history using digital tools, the opportunities to do that and reach a wider audience are much greater in a digital space, particularly when you think of a print monograph maybe only having about 100 copies sold. The audience that you can reach online using digital communication is much greater. Working with digital sources, of course, and that's both digitised and born digital, and I'll talk a bit about the differences between those two later on. Increasingly, there's researching the history of digital developments, the history of the internet, the history of these digital tools and transformed our lives over the past 30, 40 years in particular. And then using, ultimately, if it's done well, trying to do new kinds of historical research, or to do our old ways of researching more effectively and more imaginatively. That's been talked about for as long as people have talked about digital history. Oh, in the next few years we're going to open up lots of new questions and new ways of doing things, and we always seem to be just at the point where we're going to do that and never quite get there. But I think it's starting to move in that direction with some of the really big digital projects that are happening now. So taking the first of those, communicating history digitally, This really ties in very strongly back to that history of computing of the 1980s, which had a very strong pedagogical focus. They really saw the potential of computing to transform the way people learned. So it's very much concerned with pedagogy and the democratisation of knowledge, this opening up of historical knowledge and expertise to a wider audience. And because of that, it has a very clear overlap with public history. And that distinguishes American digital history in particular. I think there's a very strong connection there to public history. It covers a huge range of activities in very, very different contexts, from an audience of 2 specialists to an audience of thousands of people. And it's not just limited to researchers in universities. I don't know how many of you have come across the concept of citizen science, of people contributing to scientific knowledge by identifying galaxies, photographs of galaxies and so on. And that's moved into citizen history and is now being generalised as citizen research, I think. That digital technologies allow us to involve a much greater number of people, not just as audiences for research, but as researchers and contributors to what we're doing, people that we can work alongside in digital areas. Give a couple of examples. Very basic form of digital communication. I don't know how many of you are on Twitter, but there are some wonderful historical Twitter accounts. Some of them are pastiches, but some of them are actually really engaging with people and presenting history in imaginative ways. So this account here tweets the diaries of Samuel Pepys in real time. And that's making this accessible to people who would never have come across it, would never sit down and read Samuel Pepys' diary in full, but they will check every day to see what might be coming out on Twitter. Linking on from Samuel Pepys and moving to pedagogy, the Great Fire of London, this wonderful resource that was developed by the Museum of London. And it combines fairly traditional presentation of resources for the study of the Great Fire alongside a children's game. You can reconstruct the Great Fire of London in Minecraft, so it's starting to bring gaming in there as well, and really opening up history using digital tools to children in particular, but also as a great resource for teachers. So playing with history, and this I think is something that distinguishes the digital as well, and gaming and those sorts of approaches are coming in and really allowing immersive historical experiences from primary school onwards. This is one of the main examples of this citizen science, citizen research approach. It's an organisation called Zooniverse, which started out with Galaxy Zoo, which was this astronomy identification and crowdsourcing. But that has quickly moved into history because that's an area where there's such great public interest. And they're getting people to largely to transcribe historical material and work together as a group to achieve something that couldn't be done by individuals on their own because the scale of the materials and the transcription is so huge. And this idea of crowdsourcing tended to be quite one way. It was a grand academic coming up with an idea which they then got ordinary people, non-experts, to do for them. But I think that relationship is shifting, and some of the people who get involved with these projects become experts in their own right, and it then becomes a process of co-creation of historical knowledge, and I think that's a really exciting thing that's been opened up by digital research. In terms of working with digital sources, we most often mean digitised, the traditional resources that historians use, which are now available in digital form and can be searched and interacted with in different ways as a result. And we need, I think, to consider more how those digital objects have been created. What's the difference between a digitised newspaper and a physical newspaper? What's the nature of the text that you're actually searching? How accurate is it? What do we gain? What do we lose when we don't have that material object in front of us anymore? So theorising what working with digitised sources means for our practice is very important. So they're not replacements, they're different objects, digitised sources, and we need to think about them in different ways. And I think we're only just starting really to do that. We still just treat them as a not quite as good a substitute for the thing that we'd like to have in the archive. But actually they do open up new ways of working and new potential. And then increasingly we have a huge range of what are called born digital sources which have never had a physical form. They've always existed digitally, and those are going to be the sources that historians are starting to work with now and will definitely need to work with in the next 20 or 30 years. So that might be the archive of the web. The British Library is archiving the UK web every year, huge quantity of information there. Social media, how would you study Donald Trump if you didn't have access to his Twitter account in 50 years' time? Email archives, those again American presidential email archives being opened up to researchers. And they're difficult, complicated things to work with. There's huge amounts of duplication in there. You've got different privacy issues because so many people get copied in to conversations. How do you unpick what's personal, what's business? So we need to come up with new ways of dealing with this material as well. Personal archives tend to be neither one thing nor the other. The British Library, for example, just had a deposit of Will Self and Hanif Qureshi's archives. And that's boxes of paper, but it's also hard drives and floppy disks. So we have to think how we're going to deal with that as well. Government deposits to the National Archives now are increasingly file systems, not paper records anymore. So it's a challenge for the archives and it's a challenge for us as researchers. And this is a problem that goes back decades. Digital material has been deposited at libraries and archives for a very long time now. Looking at the history of the digital, we need to develop much more sophisticated understandings of the context of things like the internet and digital ways of communicating. They're affected by us, by the ways in which we work, by the people we communicate with. And again, we're only just at the start of looking at all this and thinking about the context in which people might read e-books in the way that we think about how we might have read early printed books. There's a lot to be learned from existing practice as well. I think you often hear that, oh, this is all new, all this digital stuff, but it isn't. Paleography of medieval manuscripts can help you think about how you approach a digital document as well. There's also the material culture of the digital. How are people interacting with this? What's the difference between a computer from 2000, which still had dial-up broadband, and how did that affect what people looked at, what their experience was compared to what it might be like now? And I think oral history is having something of a resurgence here because we know that we need to find out people's experience of working in digital environments while they're still alive to tell us about it. So there's a growing interest in oral histories of the digital. This is a wonderful project in France called Web 90. And I don't know if you know, but France developed its own internet system called Minitel, which is completely different from everything else. So this project is talking about people's experiences of using that, but it's also collecting the hardware that was used to deliver it so that they can reconstruct it and get that material culture alongside people's lived experience and like thinking about the data itself and the text as a source. And I think that kind of interdisciplinarity is a really good way of trying to capture some of this. And then we get on to the big question, are we doing anything new? Are we doing anything other than just doing the same things but doing them a bit more quickly and doing them at more scale? I think that still characterises a lot of digital historical research. It's just searching thousands of documents rather than reading 10. And that's transformative in its own way, but it's not doing anything particularly exciting. But interdisciplinary collaboration, partnerships between computer scientists, computational linguists, historians are really opening up new ways of working, and that's facilitated by the large quantities of information you can get when you're working with digital materials, and that ability to scan through a huge corpus of information, distant readings it's called, rather than close reading every single word. And it's very much not about just applying computational techniques to historical research. For me, it needs to start with the historical research questions and then find out how we can use technology to answer them, rather than, oh, this is a cool piece of technology, let's see what we can do. Historians still need to be at the heart of this process. A trend that's emerging, I'm sure you've all heard people talking about big data in various ways, in various different contexts, but certainly this, the ability to work with much more data than previously has led to a focus again on big history and long chronological spans and the identification of trends and patterns, often over centuries. Again, this is not a new historical trend. Focus on the longue durée is something that dates back to the 20th century as well. But there are unique opportunities now, I think, to discover the lives and voices of ordinary people, because so much of this digital data that we've got access to is produced by people like the people sitting in this room, by people like me, not by the great and the good. There are opportunities to capture that, and history from below, I think, can be reinvigorated by things like social media in a way that it's not when you only have the papers of government and administration. So there's room for both that big history and also the micro history, the storytelling, and I think that's something that really characterises digital history, is the ability to move between the two and use one to do the other more effectively. Just to conclude really with an example of one of the projects that I think is really demonstrating the ways in which digital history can be transformative is this project, Digital Panopticon, which is run from the University of Liverpool. And that's looking at convicts in Britain and Australia over the 18th and 19th and 20th century. And it's aggregated huge amounts of information. And it allows you now to search across this vast quantity of data by surname, by hair colour, by description, by religion, by place of birth, by height, even by complexion, because they're combining medical records with economic data, with court records, and putting that all together to allow you to uncover things in these records that you wouldn't be able to find otherwise. And it's extraordinarily flexible. And allows visualization of the search results. You can just click a button and visualize them in different ways and find out how many people convicted of murder who had brown hair and brown eyes were transported to Tasmania. That's not the kind of thing that you could have done with traditional research methods, and I think it's really starting to blaze a new trail for digital history. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Jane. We'll have some time for questions at the end. Does anyone have anything specifically that they want to ask Jane about what she was speaking about there? Okay, so next up we're going to move on, and my colleague Jonathan is going to speak, and he's going to talk a little bit about tools for digital history. So over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Danny. I'm going to sit down because I've got a bad back. If you can't hear me, I'll try standing up and work through the agony. But I've only got 15 minutes, so what I'm going to try and do is talk about how to find, these are tools for research, not the kind of tools Jamie was talking about for dissemination, how to find the tools you need to get the job done, how to choose between them, because I'm confident you'll find multitudes of tools that do roughly the same thing, and then some tips on how to learn them based on my own experience of failing to learn lots of tools. And if I have time, if Danny doesn't stop me or Gladwell's lawyers don't stop me, I'm going to criticise the writer and speaker Malcolm Gladwell at the end. But first of all, I thought I would just say that, as Jane was saying really, we all use digital tools, and the ones we get comfortable and familiar with we tend to take for granted. So I would suggest that we all try first before trying something new to make sure we're getting the best out of the tools we actually have. For example, something that probably we all use every day, and if you're like me, you use it all the time every day, most people don't think about the tool, is a computer keyboard. What's happened over the last couple of decades is, as you know, computing hardware has got more and more powerful and cheaper. And I think that as the margins of the hardware producers have got more and more squeezed, they produce worse and worse and cheaper keyboards. So if you type all day, at least consider upgrading to a better keyboard. It could change your life, I promise you. And this is the only time in this talk I'm going to suggest that you spend money on anything. For the rest of it, I think you can go the free route every time. So that's my pitch for the keyboard. So in terms of how to find tools, the first and most obvious thing you shouldn't neglect is to ask people you might know. If you know someone who works even in a tangential field to the thing that you want to do, they probably have experience and can suggest a tool or know somebody else that's a great route to go down. If you don't know anybody at all, but you find an online project which is doing something like you want to do, it's perfectly okay to get in touch with that project and say, can you tell me what your toolkit was? Most online digital projects, particularly ones I've been involved in, are just pleased someone's paid any attention at all to what they're doing. So they really won't mind if you get in touch and ask questions. If you don't want to do that, you don't like interacting with people, there are various websites around where people are interviewed about the tools they use to do various tasks. And they can be a really good source of information when you find something that aligns with you. The one I really like is called Uses This. You can filter by the operating system that they use, and you can filter by the kind of work they do. And there are 3 historians interviewed on Uses This. And the great thing is that they all use completely different tools to each other, which is a really good reminder there is no platonic toolkit for digital history. It depends who you are and what you're doing and your personal taste. So don't let anybody, including me, tell you what to use and what not to use, even though I'm tempted as I have this platform. If you find something on one of these interview sites, or someone tells you to use, say, Photoshop, and you don't want to pay for Photoshop, or you run an operating system which Photoshop doesn't work on, there's a really great site called Alternative 2, where you can type in the name of the thing you're looking for, and people will suggest, as you can guess, alternatives. So I typed in Photoshop, and I found this is just a couple of the free tools that you can use as an alternative to Photoshop. This is a really good way of finding out what's the next best thing, or even the better thing, than Photoshop. It also has lots of other things that are not digital tools, like alternatives to Rihanna, alternatives to pizza, that kind of thing as well. Endlessly useful. And finally, there are listings of tools. I actually made one myself about 5 years ago. It's not one I'm going to recommend. The one I recommend is called Bamboo Dirt. Dirt, it's not a very attractive name, but it does stand for Digital Research Tools. And it's a pretty comprehensive listing of tools you could use for humanities research across the board, not just history, but it's very comprehensive. My only caveat with Bamboo Dirt is it's so big that some of these categories here have 90 or 100 tools in them, and that can make it difficult to choose between them. So now I've got a few dimensions along which you might want to choose your tools when you found out there are actually 90 of them, what you're going to do. The first up is, are you going to pay for it, or is it free? The great thing about free ones is you could download 5 different ones and trial them all. I think if you pay for things, you get the sunk cost fallacy kicks in, which is where you think, well, I paid for this, so I'm going to carry on using it, even though it's terrible. It's a bit like those people who say, I hate this book I bought for my holiday, I can't wait to finish it. And anyway, what can you say? The advantages of paid-for software, I'm struggling a bit to think of any really, but sometimes they have better documentation, sometimes they have better support, but really with the mainstream free tools, they actually have really good forums, really good support and documentation as well. I don't think there's much to choose from. One slight thing is that you might find paid-for tools, sometimes everyone's using them in certain contexts, and you have to just fit in with what the crowd are doing, even though the crowd have chosen badly. Online, or whether you download it, the great advantage for downloading software is, not downloading software, is you don't have the problems of setting up, configuring, little problems that come up when you try and install software locally. So it's great to try things out online first. The difficulty you'll find, I think, is that you'll quite soon hit the limits of what you can do with online software. And that's when you've kind of graduated to the point where you want to download it. You'll understand it better by that point. And try it locally. Also, do be aware that if you're doing research which relies on something happening in the cloud, what you're really relying on is something happening on someone else's computer. So if you've got a long-term project, I would at least think about what's your backup plan if somehow the site goes offline, you're blocked from access, they lose your data, all that kind of thing, because it can happen and does happen. Some tools just do one thing and are very precisely targeted, but many tools are what I would think of as Swiss Army knives. This is a matter of taste, but my caveat here is that I think computing culture has changed now, and we've kind of lost sight of the fact that most tools we're using now are really these Swiss Army knife type tools. A good example is Microsoft Word, which is not not just a kind of typing program. It does typesetting, it does search, it does version control, it does spell checking. It does lots of different things. There is a different approach, which is to use one tool for each of those. One version control tool, one search tool, one spell checking tool, and so on. The reason you might want to do that is then you can choose the best in each category. Sometimes when you're doing a very precise bit of work, you might find that the element of the tool which is built in just doesn't do what you need, and then you're kind of stuck. So for example, Microsoft Word has got an absolutely terrible search interface, the worst of any I've ever come across. And it's not impossible, it's quite hard to do external search in Word. So that's when you kind of get locked into the ecosystem of that kind of Microsoft Office world and other similar things. This one's a bit of a hard one to sell to humanities people in general. For some reason, they hate the command line. I don't understand why, because it's all about text and syntax, so you'd think this should be right up your street, but lots of people absolutely hate it. To give an example, this is a kind of conventional graphical interface. Find and replace in a text file. I'm finding hello. I type it into the find box, and I'm replaced with goodbye. If you want to do the same thing in the command line, that's what it looks like. I've put it in big underneath so you can read the command. That might look a little bit more off-putting, and for a single file it's probably not worth doing it. But the advantage here is that you can change 10,000 files or 1 million files all at the same time with just that one command. It's 30 characters at most. So in general, when you want to scale up, you want to do work at large scale, either in terms of the number of files you want to work on or the size of the files. If you're working with massive files, the command line is the way to go. Otherwise, graphic interfaces are absolutely fine. New or old, I've tried to be neutral. I don't know if I've succeeded throughout this list, but I can't be neutral here. I'm very much a fan of old software, particularly when it comes to working with text. As James was saying, this has been done for decades and decades. The tools that people invented in the 60s and 70s have been refined, some of them, kept going, updated, and they're absolutely fantastic. One of the main problems with new software is, I think, well illustrated by this quotation from Henry Petrovsky. I think of it as if the hardware developers are adding lane after lane to a highway, but the car makers are making the cars wider and wider the whole time. So now we're driving down 50-lane highway with a car that's 50 lanes wide and wondering why we're not getting anywhere. That's why modern software is so slow and bloated, but you can just go back to the old stuff. The classic tools work really well and they're really fast in a modern computing environment because they're designed for something much slower and less powerful. And finally, a really simple question, do you enjoy it? Once you've kind of got the basics of the tool, once you kind of know your way around it, if you're not enjoying using it, that's the time to say to it, things aren't working out between us. I want to see other software. Don't contact me or I'll have my lawyers uninstall you. So yeah, you must enjoy it, otherwise you won't do good work. A couple of years ago I stopped wanting to type anything because the keyboards I was typing were so horrible to use. Now I've got a really good keyboard. As I say, it makes all the difference just to plug the good keyboard again. So finally, how to learn. As I say, this is really based on my history of failures and things I've done wrong rather than any insight into success. But first of all, I'd say get a book. It's quite an old-fashioned thing. A lot of techie people I know would never consider buying a book. I think you should get a book because it gives you a real sense of what there is to learn. You get a scope straight away. It's the size of the book, the paper. You can look at the table of contents. It's really clear what there is to learn and to know. It's a kind of map of the territory. Also, it has an index, and that's absolutely vital because at some point when you're learning this thing, you're going to get stuck. And what you want to do then is a web search. And the key to a good web search is to use the right terminology, which may not be obvious when you're trying to learn for the first time. The index will have all the right terms, and if you Google with those, you're much more likely to get the right answer than if you think what the term might be. Secondly, no one ever does this really. Read the documentation that comes with the tool. It's incredible what you can learn in there. You don't have to go, the first time, you don't have to go through the whole thing and learn it. You don't have to absorb it. Just get a sense of what's in there, So that when later on you think, well, I think there was something in the documentation about how to do this, then you go back and find out what you should do. But it's really important to read the documentation. There are a couple of different types of websites I'd recommend for learning. First of all, the Q&A sites, which I think are great because you can see from the most asked questions what the things that people get stuck with on this tool. Here is an example from Stack Overflow, a programming website. This is a question about how to exit the Vim editor. It's just a text editor that if someone wants to close down, they're stuck. This question has been viewed in the last 5 years over 1.25 million times. So bear in mind, these are essentially developers and programmers who are in this site. If you ever get intimidated by people who do coding, just remember, thanks, that 1.25 million of them can't even close a text editor. Don't worry. You're not alone. And in fact, if they read the documentation for Vim, it's the very first thing, and the very first line, it will tell you what to do. So read the docs again. There's a really great, for historians, there's a really great set of online free lessons called Programming Historian. I really recommend them. There are 66 now. They don't assume any knowledge whatsoever. So I really think that's a great place to start. You don't have to have any technical background. It will explain everything at the beginning of the lesson. And finally, the key thing that when you're learning is to keep going. When you get stuck, you're going to need something to kind of get you past the difficult points and keep you learning. And so I'd have a project that will give you a sense of a goal and a sense of your progress. If you're just kind of meandering around, which is what I've done lots of times when I've tried to learn things, you really won't get very far. So have a project and a goal in mind. So finally, I think I've got 1 minute, Danny, for Gladwell. Okay, so as you may know, Malcolm Gladwell has come up with this thing called the 10,000 hour rule, which is, he claims, it takes 10,000 hours to achieve mastery, 10,000 hours of practice to achieve mastery at something. That is, I'm quoting here from Anders Ericsson, that's wrong in several ways. He also uses the word misleading and misunderstood with Gladwell. The reason that this annoys me, and I've actually made a slide of it, is that it's very off-putting, isn't it? Who's got 10,000 hours to spare for anything? If you did an hour a day for continuously without stopping, you'll finish your 10,000 hours sometime in 2045. That's intimidating. It makes mastery seem impossible. The great news is Gladwell is completely wrong. Anders Ericsson is the person who did the groundwork on which Gladwell essentially falsified. What he says is very clear. Some things take a lot more than 10,000 hours, becoming a concert violinist at the highest level. Many things take way less than 10,000 hours. And the digital tools which I use all the time, and which produce amazing results, take more like 10 hours to master than 10,000 hours. So don't be put off, do try them, and I think you will achieve much more success. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. I think you really got some stuff off your chest there. Does anyone have any questions specifically for Jonathan?
I just wonder, would it be too compromising to suggest what you think of good keyboards?
That's exactly the question he wanted.
I've got several in my suitcase if you want. I can show you some. I think the key thing is get a mechanical keyboard, because the keyboards now, I don't want to go on about this too long, but they have a kind of membrane underneath them which goes, they're all mushy, you don't feel any response, they're not tactile. It's like, you know those really early kind of Casio keyboards, it's like playing one of those. There's no response. So any mechanical keyboard, I think, is great. Try a few out because they do have quite different actions. The one I use has got the great name Das Keyboard. It's not German, they just call it Das Keyboard to make it sound good. I think it's excellent, but I'm sure there are many others.
Anybody else? You plugged your keyboards enough for that? Okay, so next up is Judith, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about digital citation.
Thank you. I should say at the beginning what I'm not. I'm not a historian, so be gentle with me. And although I work for the libraries, the Bodleian Libraries, I'm not a librarian either. I'm responsible for the Bodleian's digital project portfolio, so I work with developers and academics to create the kind of tools and resources that we all use when we research. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our own practices.
Can you speak up a bit, please, or
Sorry.
speak it closer to the microphone, please?
Is that better?
Yes. Thank you.
So, in a room full of historians, I don't have to convince you of the importance of sources.
You need to be near the microphone.
It sounds really loud to me. Is that better? Okay. So Julian Barnes here points to a challenge that is only amplified in the digital, that we have the imperfections of memory and we have the inadequacies of documentation, and indeed the inadequacies of documentation around the creation and the context of the creation of digital resources. And we might also see parallels in George Orwell's imaginary state of the kind of constant overlaying of information. So formats change, and previous content is hard to access. So the CD suddenly can't be read by your device, and things get wiped and is overlaid with information. So we should always be very conscious of the value and importance of our sources in what we're trying to achieve. And we have very established mechanisms for citing our sources in print. And why do we do that? So we do that to credit our sources accurately. So we want to make it clear if we've used the second edition of something as opposed to the first edition. We want to support our arguments properly, to give good support to what we're trying to convince our readers of. We want to follow scholarly convention, so the citation practices obviously differ in a work of academic scholarship than they do in a work of popular history. And essentially we want to show that we've done the work. You know, we're not messing around, we know what we're supposed to be doing, we have to stick some footnotes in. We've done our research properly. So such is the established practice for citing in print. And I think from both Jonathan and Jane's talks, we can see that digital is now ubiquitous. We all use digital sources, we all use digital tools, and therefore we need adequate citation practices and methodologies for working in the digital. So this slide is an excerpt from a study that I did a few years ago with a colleague from the Oxford Internet Institute, which was looking at the impact of a tool called Early English Books Online, which some of you might have come across. So I worked on that together with Jonathan actually for a number of years on the text creation partnership side, which was creating the XML editions and transcriptions encoded in TI-XML. And what we wanted to look at was the impact. How can we show that this project had an impact on scholarship? So we did some surveys and some interviews, and we asked our researchers, about 200 people who responded, how often do you use online resources in your research? And at that point in 2013, it was, you know, more than half are using daily, and that's only going to increase. It's not going to decrease, it's just going to continue. And we also asked, so you use these tools, do you cite them? Do you mention your use of digital resources in your research? And we asked both, how do you do that in your own research, and how do you teach your students? If you teach students, what do you tell them to do? And we got a real mixed bag of results, which I think demonstrates that there's an uncertainty around how people want to do this. So some people only cite the online version. Some people with EBO, it's a case of images of an early printed book and a transcription. Some people would cite a print citation and the URL that they've access to at. Some people would cite a print citation and say it was online but not give a URL. Some people only cite print, so they will elide the fact that they've used a digital resource entirely and just give a print citation as if they've gone to the Bodleian Library and pulled up the book from the stacks and looked at it. And some people do the famous other things that people do. So I think what's interesting and was perhaps startling for us was that of teaching academics, 25% of people were teaching their students to only cite print, even if they've only used a digital resource, which we were surprised and not entirely happy about. So why don't we cite the digital in our publications and papers?
Partly it might be that journals have yet to accommodate digital citation adequately. And for another piece of work that Jonathan and I did together, wrote an article on digital citation, we surveyed journals and asked them how they accommodated digital citations. And some of them came back and said, oh, we don't get those. No, that doesn't apply to us, I don't know what you're talking about, basically. So we think that actually a lot of journals are so used to their own practices that have built up over many years that they don't actually know how to accommodate a digital citation, and nor do they actually know what we're talking about. It might be that clear guidance and precedents for citation aren't available, so people don't know what to do, they don't know how to do it. URLs can be very long, very cumbersome, they don't look very nice when you paste them into your Word document, they split weirdly, people think, terrible, just take it out, it adds to your word count, whatever. But also fundamentally, for some still, digital sources are seen as lesser than print. Researchers seek to hide their use of them in order to appear more scholarly, and I think that's a problem. So to go back to my original opening slide about sources, now rather than actually from my extensive memory of quotes about history, or to go along my bookshelves and think, what was that quote that Orwell said? I didn't do that. I googled quotes about history, and it took me to something called goodreads.com, and then I pulled up a couple of quotes. And maybe I deserve credit for having gone down to page 4 to get the order. But essentially I stuck in a couple of quotes. Now, it doesn't matter for a presentation like this where I'm just sticking in a couple of quotes to kind of dress up my presentation. But if you're doing that in an academic article or a paper, you want to know as researchers if someone has gone to something and just Googled it, stuck in something, just written a print citation. You actually want to know what people are doing. You want to know their methods. You want to know whether or not their research is reliable. And not all digital resources are equal, just as not all print resources are equal. And no disrespect to goodreads.com, I'm sure they're excellent at what they do, but they're not, I didn't go and check those quotes, they might be wrong, didn't check my sources. So you have to be careful if you're hiding what you're doing, you're essentially not allowing people to check and to verify the argument that you're making. And we do think it's important that you do that, especially for historians, I would argue. So what are the reasons why digital citation is particularly important? Well, as we've seen already this morning, the digital shift has already happened. We're already doing this. It's ubiquitous, and therefore we need to have clear ways of showing how we work. I would argue that honesty and accuracy is more important than ever in history and in public discourse, and therefore it's important that all of us show our work, show what we're basing our arguments on. As Jane mentioned, we now have lots of born digital material. You can only cite it in a digital form. You can't cite it as a print, and we're increasingly going to find more and more material like that. Sometimes you will have a print and a digital source for something, like The Guardian, for example, where you don't find all of the content that's on Guardian.com in the print version, and if you only cite, say you've got this from The Guardian, give a date, a future researcher going and trying to find that work in a library, with a print copy of The Guardian is going to come up with nothing. And a kind of plea for the digital content creator side. While I completely agree with the openness and the idea that resources should be free, and they should, that doesn't mean they have no cost. So those of us who are trying to find the funding to create resources and to maintain them, so when project funding runs out, we have to find the money to how do we keep them up, how do we get developers who can patch them and so on. In order to be able to maintain our funding for these resources, we have to be able to show the impact of them. So if it looks like no one's using them, and no one's using them in the scholarly literature, it's harder then to argue that we should continue to maintain them. So for my personal plea is that please cite us so that we can say that you're using us. So possible solutions, and while I think considering our personal digital literacy and our own personal research practices and being very kind of active to think about how we operate is one thing, and we should all be doing that. I think actually the onus is more on people like me, the digital content creators, and who are maintaining these tools to help researchers find it easy to cite their materials. So downloadable citations from websites, some are very good and do that. Things like Wikipedia, you can download a citation. Versioning is very important. So for example, if you have a set of digitized images of something, and then we, as often happens in the Bodleian, we get some better images, some better quality images, and we put them up there. If you had based your argument on the kind of shoddy images before, you want to be able to say, well, my research was based on version 1, not version 2, and version 2 shows X, Y, Z. Persistent URLs, so that people know that they can rely on something still being there, and also digital object identifiers, so that we're clear about what we're actually talking about. But I think that we should also demand intellectual rigour from our digital resources, so it should be, as Jane was saying, that knowing how a resource is created, what its editorial principles were, what you can expect of it is very important, and that when you're creating a website or a resource or a database, that if, for example, you have not proofread everything, you've only proofread a sample, or whatever it might be, you have to be clear about what you've done. And I think that digital content creators should collaborate more with academics and researchers so that we understand what people want from our resources, so that we can create the tools that adequately do that. And I think fundamentally we just need to raise awareness of citation practices, because it's not that people aren't fundamentally dishonest. I don't think. They just think, oh, I've never thought about that. I haven't really thought this through, and now that you've pointed it out, I'll be more conscious of that in the future. And just to end with references, if you're interested in a couple of studies that I mentioned in this talk, and there again. Thank you very much.